Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, whatever part of the world you're currently listening to our podcast. Today is April the 12th, Sunday evening. It's 9 p.m. here where I'm at. I hope your weekend went well and have had the chance and opportunity to recharge your batteries. I come to you today to talk about uh, current election that just happened today in Hungary. Okay, folks. Mr. Orban, who's been in office for quite some time, was opposed by a former colleague of his, and who eventually decided to run against him. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the pre-existing conditions in Europe and also throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and what could be the overall result of today's election. Okay, I haven't done enough research per se on the numbers, but I do know that Mr. Magyar, the opposition, did win the election, the general election in Hungary. So let's kind of, unpack on the overall situation in Europe and what manifested this, election result in Hungary. So I'm just gonna reflect on the last 10 years. I mean, there's been quite a bit of challenges that Europe has been faced with, mainly the European Union as a former 28 member countries that dwindled down to 27 after Britain have decided to leave the pack, basically. Matter of fact, Britain was one of the founders of the European Union. Okay, folks. Um, so, what precipitated today's win for the opposition, and how did everything kind of escalated and evolve? Mainly because of the pre-existing conditions that Europe's been plagued with. Before the war in Ukraine, Europe has been struggling to attract investment, create jobs, increase their overall market capacity, and basically unite the member states. Politically, they just struggled quite a bit. Um, why am I discussing this? Because I think it's important that we talk about the pre-existing condition that manifested to today's result in the election in Hungary. So Mr. Orban has always been opposed to the federalization and the overreach of the European Union ever since he got in power, ever since he was in office. Mainly, he does have some fairly good concerns in terms of Hungary's ability to chart its own course and destiny and build its own capacity as a marketplace. But because they're in Europe, they had to abide by, the authority of the European Union because they are a member state of the European Union. But I think looking at what took place in Britain when Nigel Farage presented his case on why it's in the best interest of Britain to leave the European Union, I think Mr. Orban saw the logic behind Brexit, and he understood that Europe is a very diverse continent and marketplace. They don't always speak the same language. They don't all operate the same way. Their political systems are fairly different. And then he had, basically pointed out that the European Union is hard pressed to really unite the markets, even though it's a single market community. He had, pointed out many times that there are quite a bit of political, uh, diversified opinions and strategies for the, various countries throughout Europe. So because of that, he's been, basically labeled as the black sheep of Europe. You know, unfortunately, that's just kind of been the case for him ever since he voiced his concern, which I think, in my opinion, a leader is supposed to voice their concern, and basically make their case. And that's what he did. And unfortunately, he wasn't drinking from the same jar of Kool-Aid, and he didn't like the certain things that are being done and deployed, and policies that are being enforced. Um, yes, they are benefiting from the European Union because they're a member state, but the European Union is actually a conglomerate of all the member states in which everybody had to participate in, shouldering the burden of donating and pooling their funds as a single market community, and basically help with capacity building in various countries. So basically, the European Union would get funds out of the budget of various member states, use that fund to build capacity of a lesser, wealthier, powerful member state. Okay, so then Hungary did benefit from, those type of support and resources by the European Union. But sometimes, you know, a country cannot always, uh, you know, especially a sovereign state, cannot just say yes all the time to a superior authority that is not within their country. Um, it's just impossible to do that. And I think Nigel Farage in Britain have proven that Britain cannot bow down and always, agree to certain conditions and policies that have been enforced and deployed by the European Union. I think many countries actually throughout Europe, and I've been traveling back and forth in Europe ever since I was even in college. Okay, I've studied portion of my schooling in UK. So it's not just the British and the Hungarian that's kind of, pushing back in terms of the overall policies that are being deployed by the European Union. Because imagine, foreign people telling a sovereign state how to operate and, how to manage their own country when they don't even speak the same language. They don't agree with certain rules and regulations of the road, and then all of a sudden they tell you, a country how to operate. Now there are checks and balances that the European Union have introduced to member states, mainly the emerging and frontier markets of these new member states, that they have the verification mechanism in which corruption and overall mismanagement of funds that have been allocated by the EU is being managed and monitored and basically supervised. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there is no value and benefit to being a member of the EU. It's just that sometimes there's some overreach involved to the point that a member state is actually being influenced at the highest level, even at their decision making level within the president prime minister's office, that is basically being governed by the European Union. So the European Union is a group of member states where they have representatives from various states. That most of those representatives weren't actually elected into office. They were basically selected by the ruling party of a member state, and they send them over to Brussels or Austria to basically represent the interests of their country and region. So that's how the European Union typically operates. Okay, but Mr. Orban had been, very influential in countering a lot of the overreach that's been deployed by the European Union, mainly because Mr. Orban understand that um, Hungary is a sovereign state, and having too much authority from an outside power, mainly Brussels, into their marketing country and their decision making ability is not in the best interest of the Hungarian population. Okay, given a perfect example is the issue with Ukraine, for example. Before Ukraine and Russia got into this whole conflict, all right, back in 2021, Mr. Orban had already raised the flag and shared his concern about this potential escalating conflict between Ukraine and Russia, okay, just because of what took place back in 2014. I mean, there's been an ongoing, headbanging between Russia and Ukraine after the Maidan Revolution in 2014, which Russia ended up having put together a referendum where people voted. I mean, it depends on who you ask, but there's people who had said, that there was a forced election and it wasn't, a legitimate, um, you know, um, event, but it took place. So the Russians ended up taking Crimea and parts of other territories like Donbass. And, most of them were already occupied by Russians, citizens or ethnic Russian people. So Orban basically raised his concern, saying that, okay, we need to be very careful and we need to supervise this overall situation because if not, it's very likely that there's going to be a war in Europe. And lo and behold, it happened in 2022. But back in 2021, Mr. Orban and most of his colleagues that agreed with his assessment um, raised that concern to the European Union and to many of the decision makers in Central and Eastern Europe. People didn't take him seriously, and lo and behold, it happened. Okay, it actually happened. So he has been against a lot of, the stick and carrot objective of the European Union pertaining to Ukraine. He didn't want to support the war. One, he didn't want to keep on, providing funds and, additional support to Ukraine because in his opinion, Ukraine's not a member of the EU, it's not a member of NATO country, and therefore, why should Hungarian citizens use taxes to be used to support a non-member country that he, in his opinion, and frankly, in my opinion as well, that could have, the war could have been prevented had, the European Union and Washington at that time, led by the Biden administration, just let the Ukrainian and Russians uh, diplomatically figure things out and amicably solve the conflict. Okay, so the I believe that Mr. Orban had exercised a prudent and very logical assessment and solution to the problem. He basically said and endorsed that Russia and Ukraine should talk and diplomatically sort things out. Okay. And so that didn't quite bode well with the European Union because many countries in the West, at that time, continuously, uh, you know, uh, try to endorse additional funds and additional weapons to be sent to Ukraine. Okay, instead of promoting diplomacy in the region and de-escalating the situation and bringing the region back to normalcy. That wasn't the case. That was not ever been endorsed up until the new administration, the Trump administration, um, took office. And because of that, Hungary had been kind of ostracized. They've been blackballed, and funds were basically withheld against the overall condition that both Hungary and the European Union agreed to, which is support to member states. So they did not receive the funds and support from the European Union due to their opposition to the war in Ukraine, led by Mr. Orban. And to me, it doesn't justify the overall mission and objective of the European Union. Their job is to support member countries, to make sure that the member countries are getting the funds and assistance that they need to build their capacity, create jobs, and then build their economy in member state countries, because their funds are coming from European citizens, taxpayers. Okay, folks. And I'm not trying to take sides. I've got no horse in this race. Okay, I'm a economic development consultant and who happens to have quite a bit of experience in emerging and frontier markets of Central and Eastern Europe. So I'm just sharing my assessment. You know, I'm not trying to take side, nor do I want to get involved in politics in Europe, because everybody knows we have problems in our politics here in America. I really don't want to get involved with politics in Europe. All I pretty much try to understand is the overall ramification of certain decisions that has been endorsed by European decision makers in terms of how it will disrupt the market and could potentially create problems down the road in their overall capacity building initiatives. That's all I'm saying. I'm not trying to take sides, but I do believe in peace. I do believe in diplomacy. I've served in the U.S. Peace Corps in Eastern Europe, supporting capacity building, institutional development, and public diplomacy. So to me, it's important that we give diplomacy a chance, give people a platform in which they can talk things out whenever there's an issue or conflict. So going back to today's election that resulted to Mr. Orban losing, which is very unfortunate in my opinion, because he was actually providing balance in Europe. He's providing the counter narrative to a narrative that's often embraced by the elites of Europe and the powerful halls that dictates to member states how things ought to be done. Now, okay, if that were to be the case, let me give you an example. So, if somebody from a completely different country tells another country that is a sovereign country how to operate, then that person or that organization or institution that have had no prior experience in the local marketplace, in the domestic conditions of a country, is basically telling them how to do things the way that they think would be done. Now, I operate in various markets in capacity building and institutional development. So I'm kind of looking at it that way, from that perspective. Basically, I go in and tell people, oh, you got to do this, this, and that, and this to be able to compete and build up your capacity and marketplace without really knowing the pre-existing conditions. So that's not the way you do things. What you do is you monitor the situation, talk to relevant experts in the region or in the domestic market, work there in that country, learn as much as you can about the country before you engage in telling them what to do. But unfortunately, that's not the case for the European Union. Many of the Western leaders that were telling Eastern and Central European countries what to do have never had any experience living, working in those countries that they're telling them what to do. So, to me, Mr. Orban provided a balanced approach to the overall pre-existing condition. But unfortunately, because their market and their country was struggling due to them not getting access to funds that they and the European Union agreed to um, partake in, it backfired against Mr. Orban to the point that it was easy to convince those that have been affected by the lack of resources in their marketplace and the lack of stability, that it'll be in their best interest to hire a new politician, which they did today. So, what is my take on what could happen long term? I believe that if the war in Ukraine persists, it's going to continue to disrupt many of the marketplace throughout Europe. And it's also going to disrupt many of the political environments, mainly those countries that supported the war in Ukraine will flip flop and become against supporting Ukraine. And many of them is actually transitioning against Ukraine now in various countries of Europe, mainly the ones that have been, flipping the bill to support many of the Ukrainian refugees and those that are having to send funds to Ukraine and weaponry and other expertise because they also provide consultants and experts to support Ukraine. Many of those countries will basically flip flop in a short period of time because they're having to shoulder, okay, much of the resources that has been diverted to go to Ukraine by the European Union. And I believe that the European Union will also experience a major uh, boat rocking. There's going to be an alternative way of management that will influence the European Union now that Orban is no longer the key player in the opposition to certain European Union policy. I believe what's going to happen, and this is my assessment, personal and professional assessment, uh, having many years experience in the region, I believe that the opposition will manifest itself in those pro-Ukraine countries in the next couple of years. And most of them are going to be more vocal than Mr. Orban and more forceful in terms of their dissatisfaction of the pre-existing condition in their country and marketplace, because many Europeans today are having to deal with the cost of living in Ukraine. I mean, I'm sorry, not Ukraine, the cost of living in Europe due to the war in Ukraine. And, prices of goods and services have skyrocketed. There's been a lot of shortfall and um, limited resources throughout the continent due to the pre-existing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So it's catching up, and it's actually catching up fairly quickly for many of the European countries. And many Europeans today are hard pressed, economically speaking. And leading up to the summer months, in which many Europeans go on vacation, it's going to be extremely hard for most Europeans now to engage in a vacation that they're accustomed to. Okay, because either jet fuel have gotten so expensive or limited in resources. There's a major deficit in access to jet fuel today um, in Western European countries. They can't trade as much anymore and sell their goods and services abroad. There's not a whole lot of investment entering Europe due to the conflict uh, in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia, and political uncertainties, uh, and there's just way too many challenges throughout Europe today that no one thought would manifest itself. No one ever thought that you know uh, an ongoing war for almost 4 years now will continue on this long. So my assessment and my overall wish and this is something that I've always hoped it had happened sooner, is that diplomacy would prevail and the war would end and bring the region back to normalcy and start creating jobs again for the citizens of Europe, attract investment, improve our relationship between Europe and the U.S. And promote capacity building. Now, I'm not saying divorce ourselves from Ukraine. I'm not saying not help Ukraine. I actually want to help Ukraine, uh, and that can only happen once Russia agrees with the terms to end the conflict. The cards, I don't see Ukraine, having so much, bargaining chip when it comes to Europe, given that many of the European countries are also struggling economically and politically. So, and like I said, I'm not taking sides. This is my professional assessment, and because I've actually lived and worked in the region. So I believe that it's in the best interest of everyone to de-escalate the situation, stop the war, and bring Europe back to normalcy and the market specifically, so that it's attractive again to investors and promote trade and commercial development among countries, and not ostracize and single out a member state that is in opposition of the pre-existing condition. I think it's important in a democracy, especially when you're trying to build a union, that you give everybody a voice. You don't silence them. You don't try to single them out. I think it's very important wherever you go in this planet to give the underrepresented, the marginalized, those that are powerless, a voice if you want to build a strong country and strong union. With this said, folks, thank you so much for watching, listening to our podcast. Please share and subscribe to our podcast and video blog, Face Economics Podcast, and YouTube TV. Share and subscribe. Tell your family and friends about us and our platform. I am the author of Face Economics, the utilization of the social media platform in economic development. Thank you so much for your time. Until we meet again, take care. Bye bye.